as Justin mentioned, I work in transport processes, fluid mechanics, particulate flows, heat transfer, things like that. And the wonderful thing about transport processes is that you can find them absolutely anywhere. So any type of problem that you look at, and from the human body to energy, involves transport processing. About 12 years ago, I got involved. The vice president for research asked me to lead this project they were trying to develop with India National Lab. There was a $1 million workforce development grant, and we had eight students and 9 faculty spend part of the summer in Albuquerque at India National Lab, and that led to a whole bunch of other things, including a solar test facility at IBM up here when IBM was here, which is now at the McNeil plant. We have a nice new DOE project to support that. It led to the IGER program that we had for 7 years, which was a blast. I still miss that program. And most recently, it's led to this grant on energy sheds, which I wanted to tell you a bit about today. And I am happy to see Dakota Hamilton here, who is an expert in power systems, which I am not. And so all the hard questions go to Dakota. So anyways, let me just tell you a little bit about it. This is the faculty involved in the Energyshed grant. I'm the PI, and I'm leading the heating and cooling team in the project. There's 3 co-PIs. Masa Masakar is leading the power systems group. Greg Wohngold is leading the transportation group, and John Erickson is leading the community engagement group. So all the faculty are kind of in one team or another. This is a big project with lots of people. So we have some great faculty working on it, and some great students. So basically what I wanted to do today was to explain a little bit, assuming that, I don't know if people know a lot about energy systems in here, or a little bit, I'm assuming very little, just what this is all about. Because when I mention this project to people, they say, what is an energy shed and why are you naming it this? So just to explain a little bit about this story. This is pretty much the current type of power systems that we use. And if you kind of look down here for a moment, this is kind of a snapshot of Vermont in 2015. And you see in the side here, you see a big fossil fuel in brown, right? A lot of fossil fuel, a little bit of bio, most of that is McNeil. So it's burning wood waste products. In 2015, we had the Vermont Yankee, so we sold the nuclear, that's no longer there. We had a little bit of hydro, mostly from Hydro-Quebec, a little bit of local hydro, and a little teeny bit of solar and wind, right? And so what you see as you look at usage, some of this goes into making electricity, right? So, but a lot of it goes into transportation and into heating, into buildings, a little bit into industry as well. And of that, the energy that's used, quite a lot of it is just lost. You'll see, especially in I don't know if you can see these gray lines here, but in transportation, a vast majority of the energy that goes into transportation is just lost because the auto cycle that we use to run our cars is horribly inefficient. It's only got like 15 or so, 18% efficiency. So very inefficient. And diesel's a little bit more efficient, but not a lot. It's still in the 20s, right? Compared to an electric motor, which is efficiency up to 70% and above. Also our buildings have a lot of inefficiencies, right? Heating our buildings, we don't know what Vermont buildings are like. They look like this, right? And so this is kind of the snapshot of where we are. In current power systems, there's very little storage, almost no storage. So basically that means the load is fluctuating, you don't control the load, and the power companies, the power utilities have to make whatever is required in the load. So they're constantly adjusting their supply. They're curtailing if the load is small. They're putting on, power plants that are just sitting there. They're called peaking plants, and they just sit there most of the time and do nothing. But then every once in a while, when the load gets high, they have to start, operating these peaking plants, and when the load is high. So it's a fairly inefficient system. It's a system where we have generation at central facilities. We have a transmission system which brings the power and high voltage lines from these facilities to close to where it's going to be used. And we have substations that convert the voltage down to lower values that goes to the distribution systems, right? So that's a very one-way type system, generation, and then it goes to the users, right? So we have a comprehensive energy plan. The state approved it in 2016. It's been twice revised since, as recently as 2022, and it's very different. It envisions a very different type of Vermont. Vermont in 2050, according to our comprehensive energy plan, will look like this. The fossil fuel ban, very, very small. The hydro and wind ban is large, and this isn't mostly Hydro-Quebec. This is mostly locally produced wind and solar. There's a big bio ban as well. Now, how realistic this is, we can talk about in the discussion part of the talk. I personally don't see where we're going to get this much bio, but that's a different story. The other thing you'll notice is that there's a lot lower loss and waste and a lot more productive use of energy, right? So one of the big features of the comprehensive energy plan is a major push towards more efficient energy systems. And there's two major ways that the plan proposes to do this. One is to have mostly electric vehicles. And as I mentioned, electric motors far more efficient than the gasoline motors. The second way is to have houses mostly heated by heat pumps. And heat pumps, I'm sure you're familiar with, but they're kind of magic in that they have efficiencies which are, something like 3 or above sometimes. And people say, well, how can you have an efficiency greater than 1? But what they do is they use the energy to refrigerate the outside and move the heat from the outside into the inside. So that instead of just taking that heat and dissipating it, instead of taking the electricity and dissipating it into heat, they take it and move the energy. So that's a highly efficient method. So in this scheme, 90% of all energy needs, not just electricity, but transportation and heating, will be from renewable sources, and mostly, as I said, mostly local renewable sources. Most of these sources are distributed, so there will be solar farms and wind farms, but a lot of them are just solar on people's roofs, right? So very highly distributed system, widespread use of heat pumps and electric vehicles, a third less energy overall through efficiency measures. So that's the plan. What that plan misses is that it's not just a matter of, okay, we're going to generate a lot of energy with solar and wind. But what that misses is that the whole energy system is different, right? Because we no longer have a centralized, system where there's one-way transmission from the generator to the, everybody, but instead it's really distributed. So everything from the lines to the substations to the control system, the whole system is different because it's fundamentally different. If we were to try to take a very distributed renewable energy system and try to implant it on the existing infrastructure, it just wouldn't fit. So the interesting thing about this system is that in addition to the load fluctuating in a way that you can't control, the supply also fluctuates in a way that you can't control. You can't control when the wind blows. You can't control when the sun shines. You can't control when the cloud passes over the solar panel. So there's this fluctuating, the control problem is the problem that both the load and the supply are fluctuating, and yet you have very little storage, so storage is expensive. So you have to mostly make the load and the supply equal each other. So how are you going to achieve that? So there's a large number of sources. Some of the sources are what's called dispatchable. So there's a central controller that can turn them on or off. Some of the sources aren't dispatchable, like your solar on your roof. And so the idea is that in this scenario, there would be regions that consume more energy than they produce, right? So there would be regions like cities, like Burlington, that consumes a lot of energy, which isn't producing that energy. And then there would be broad regions around there, mostly rural regions, that are producing more energy than they consume. So it's a little bit like if you think of how food is handled or how water is handled, right? That there's a broad region over which water falls, and that's collected to rivers and goes to areas of consumption. In 2009, Mark Hughes from University of Pennsylvania proposed this idea of an energy shed, sort of an analogy to a watershed or a food shed. And his statement, I hate to read this, but I'm going to because it's kind of interesting. And it says significant aspects of energy generation, distribution, consumption operate at a regional scale. Again, he's thinking of the future energy system, not so much the current energy system. These operations, which are a function of both technical and organizational realities, interact to form an energy shed. So for him, an energy shed is, he says, an organizing idea, which includes all of the or not all, but some fraction of the generation about a consumption region. It's an organizing idea that is for the purpose of understanding the connections between urban form and energy use, and engages local stakeholders in optimizing energy. So there's been a handful of papers on this idea. DeRolf was a group at Oak Ridge National Lab. They mapped some energy sheds of major cities. They included fossil fuels though. But I just wanted to kind of explain what we mean by energy shed. Really, there's four qualifiers that you need to set. The first is place, right? So energy sheds are associated with some region of consumption. Where I live in Jericho, might have an energy shed, and Burlington, might have a much bigger energy shed, right? Which maybe includes the Jericho energy shed, right? So each one would be associated with a region of consumption, which could scale from large communities to small communities. It would be associated with some source. So you could look at energy sheds associated with solar energy or wind or all energy or all renewable energy, right? You would have to define what type of energy shed you're interested in. There would be a time frame. So you could look at energy sheds defined, generally these are planning tools, right? So usually it's not like a second or a minute, but it's usually, a time frame which is longer, like a year or maybe a decade, over which you would do planning. But you would have to specify the time frame, and you would have to specify the percentage of your energy. So for instance, just to do a little cartoon here, if we have a little region of consumption, think of it as a little city, and around we have some rural area, which is producing, the red area is producing more energy than it's consuming, the blue is consuming more than it's producing. And so to specify an energy shed here, we would say, oh, the place, it's city X, that's city X right there. Our source, well, let's just pick all renewable energy. We pick something. A time, let's pick 1 year. And percentage of energy, let's pick 90%, right? So if we look at the energy, so here's our city X. This is a map, again, idealized map of the energy that's purchased by city X over this time period, the renewable energy that's purchased by city X. You don't have to follow where the electrons go. You can just look at the market, cities purchasing energy, right? So that has, it's a gradient, right? This is done over a period of that we'd selected over a period of 1 year. And then so there's no energy shed here, but then if you use, okay, well, I want to draw some curve that contains 90%, that was the fraction that we picked of the energy, in that year. So we would call this an energy shed of that city. Okay, so that's one way to define something, but why would you do it? And so this is a plot of, this is spatial scales and time scales, and all sorts of issues that a grid operator would have to try to worry about, right? And so the grid operator is looking at all these kind of issues at all these different scales. The purpose of an energy shed, if I could direct you over to here, is to help in a number of things, right? And again, it doesn't have much purpose in the current energy scenario, but in the future energy scenario, where there's a very distributed energy, we see this, for one thing, as infrastructure planning, right? You have to invest in things from electric lines to substations, generation, and so forth, which will provide sufficient energy for your region of consumption. So it's a planning tool. It's a tool to model and evaluate the stability and reliability of power. So if there's a storm that passes through, think of a big ice storm that passes through and affects part of the region that is generating the energy which feeds your city, well, you have to, know how the energy generated in that region affects the power to the city. It's as my friend John Erickson likes to say, it's a method to try to get from NIMBY to YIMBY, right? So it's a method to try to relate the consumption of energy in a consumption region to give value to generation of energy in rural regions, right? And so that's done in part by a market, which would have to value the contribution to rural regions, but it's also done by just making people aware of, where does your energy go? And it's also a way of looking at energy justice, which I'll get to in a second. So one of the challenges with the future energy system is the issue of variability. As I mentioned, the source is fluctuating, the load is fluctuating. You can't control either one, and yet they have to equal each other. So how do you deal with that? This is a typical plot of the variability in solar energy. And so what you can see is that if it's very overcast, that's this red and white line down here. There's not a lot of variability. There's not a lot of energy being produced. If it's very sunny all day, that's this blue line up here. There's also not a lot of variability. But in the in-between states where there's clouds, if you look at the purple line, that's clouds passing over, your solar, it's mostly sunny, but you got a lot of clouds. There can be a lot of variability. So depending on the weather, you can have a lot of variability. This is a one-day period. So you see, fairly rapid fluctuations in the solar generation. In wind, this is the Van der Hoeven spectrum for wind energy. Interesting spectrum. There's kind of two peaks. One of them is associated with weather systems passing through. So roughly every 4 days, you get a new weather system. The other is associated with turbulence in the atmosphere. See, I told you fluids is everywhere, right? So you get turbulence that has roughly timescale of around 1 minute. Interestingly, wind turbines respond in a highly nonlinear way to variations in wind. This is the plot of power versus wind speed for a typical wind turbine. And until the wind gets above a certain cut-in speed, the wind turbine doesn't turn at all. It's just sitting there. I'm sure you've all seen that. Once it gets into the cutoff speed, there's two regimes of operation. In the first regime, there's a constant pitch. So the pitch of the blades is constant, but the RPM, the rotation rate of the blades is variable. And in this region, the power varies roughly with the velocities cubed, right? So there's a power varies with velocity cubed regime, so highly nonlinear, right? And then up here, you have a variable pitch, constant RPM region. So here, the pitch of the blades is adjusted to keep the speed constant. And then if the wind gets too high, you turn it off, right? So you probably see very windy days, and the wind turbines are all turned off, because if you let it go more than that, you can damage the wind turbine. So highly nonlinear response to variations in wind. The blue line here, this is output from a typical wind turbine. The blue line shows the noisiness. This is about a 2.5 hour period. So that's a lot of variability, right, in wind. And you can see this is for a whole wind farm. So if you average this signal over lots of wind turbines, you get a little bit less variability, but still highly variable. So how do we deal? One of the biggest problems with the next generation energy system is, how do you deal with that variability? And one thing to remember is that what you get at the source is not what you experience in the consumer. It changes through the system. And one of the ways that it changes is by averaging. And this is a fortunate thing. You can average signals, like let's say you have a look at solar energy. One solar panel might be highly variable, but when you average that over a lot of solar panels and a lot of geographic locations, all that averages cancel out. In fact, if these were random signals that are independent of each other, we know from mathematics that the variance reduces like 1 over the square root of the number of signals, right? So a little bit of math there. But anyways, so averaging reduces the amount of variability. Averaging also over different types of energy. So wind is variable, solar is variable, but they're variable in different ways. right? So when we average over them, sometimes that cancels out. There's also types of renewable energy like hydropower, geothermal if you live in Hawaii, which are not particularly variable. They're known as dispatchable energy. You can easily turn them on and off and adjust them to what you want. So that's useful for making up the, for accounting for the variations in the variable sources. So all of that allows us to reduce the variability, but the market also has an effect. So here's an example that shows what I refer to as downstream amplification of variability. So consider two regions. We have region A, which is a producing region. It's a source, makes more energy than it needs. And we have a consumption region B, right? So it doesn't make much energy, it has to buy energy. So one way that you could construct your market, a logical way, if you just pay for energy, right, is that region A would produce more energy than it needs. So here's the variability, maybe it has 10% variability. It basically uses what it needs and it sells the rest up here to region B, right? Okay, so its power supply is nice and steady because it's using a lot less than what it generates. So it takes the rest and it goes to region B, but now region B doesn't have 10% variability, it has 30% variability, right? Its variability has increased because it only gets the extra power that region A sold to it. So that's one way you could set up a market. If you do it like this, as you go downstream from producer to consumer, the variability gets greater. You could also set up the market in other ways. You could set up a market so that there's value to steady power. In other words, you could price in the variability into the market. And if you did that, then maybe you could put incentives enough so region A might want to send this nice steady power to region B and deal with the variability itself because it would be financially viable. So that's what I mean. The market itself has to change to account for this variability. So how do we deal with that now? Because we do have renewable sources in the power supply now. And so this is what a typical control room looks like. If you go to ISO New England or Velco, that's what their control room looks like. One way we deal with that is we limit the amount of renewables in our system. So typically renewables might be 10% or something like that. You can account for that variability. As the amount gets larger, it gets harder. We curtail renewables. So you would think, if you build a wind farm, you'd always get the, that's what we want to do, right? And you would have priority over all the fossil fuels, but you don't. I mean, often if you have a very renewable source, those are the ones that often get curtailed, right? So we limit the amount of renewable energy that we can produce because we can only handle so much variability in the grid. We also have dispatchable power. We have peaking power plants that generate power for peaks, but they're the dirtiest, most expensive power. So that's none of these are great ways of dealing with it. Yeah, I don't have time to tell you a story, so I'll go on. So there's kind of two ideas that our group is looking at for how to deal with this. The one way is the idea of virtual batteries. So in a virtual battery, basically you would say, okay, everything is electrified, including transportation and heating and computers and all this stuff. But I'm going to make some system. So this probably wouldn't be different power systems, but it would be something like what packetized energy makes. So something that would attach to your, they were dealing with water heaters, right? And it would attach to your water heaters and it would allow the utility to control when the water heater goes on and off, right? So a system like that where you can adjust the timing for things that operate on a long time scale to give preference to things that need power right now. So in other words, you're heating your hot water tank in your house, you're heating your house. These are things that, if you stop, for a minute or two, it really wouldn't make a difference, right? So you can adjust, those are long time scale things, charging your electric vehicle, right? So you can adjust when you do that and how much energy you use for that and give preference to things like running your computer or your TV that, if you pause for a minute, it would make a big difference, right? So that's the idea of a virtual battery, to essentially use smart control of how the power is used in the grid to move the timing of long time scale uses to give preference to short time scale uses. This obviously requires a control system that manages a bunch of things, including grid stability, thermal comfort of building occupants, right? You wouldn't want it to be, okay, we have extra energy, so we're going to heat your building up to 80 degrees today. Obviously don't want that. Vehicle charging times, right? You want your car charged when you want it charged. So there's a lot of things to consider here. Another thing that we're looking at in our group is community solutions. So if we have very distributed energy sources, we want to also have maybe distributed storage of different types, right? So we are looking at things like, a little neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood, we do this with water, right? We have 80 homes and we have one well for everybody, and little neighborhood association operates the well. We could do similar things with power storage, right? We could have a neighborhood, everyone has solar panels on the roof. We have some neighborhood battery here, or maybe neighborhood thermal storage, and we have a little district water heating type thing, on a neighborhood scale. So, there's issues with this from fairness and cost and stability, but I think there's a lot of potential in that. So anyways, that's kind of my timing's very good. This is kind of a quick overview. We have a project from the Department of Energy. They funded 3 projects in the country. So we got one of them, a $4.3 million project. We're about halfway through the first year of it. It's a 3-year project, 11 faculty, 3 national labs, 4 utilities, 3 NGOs, and we're 3 Vermont communities that we're modeling. Basically, the objective is to examine place-based renewable power generation with the concept of an energy shed, where we're defining an energy shed as a geographic region that generates the energy used for its zone of consumption. The specific goal is to develop new tools, to work with the Department of Energy labs to develop new tools so that community stakeholders, people who are on town energy planning committees who've never done computation in their lives, they're not engineers or environmental scientists, and so they can go and play with these tools to look at economic and environmental and social and power trade-offs that should I put a solar farm here, should I put a wind farm here, what's the effect on my community? Okay, so that's the objective of our tools. We've into a set of specific objectives. So right now we're kind of collecting data on these sample communities. We're meeting with the town energy boards, to get them involved in this study because they're going to be beta testing this for us. We're looking at the existing Department of Energy simulation models and working with the national lab people to try to get to know these models. So that's pretty much where we are, and I think I'm exactly on time.